All right, welcome everyone to Chicago Autism Network's virtual parent workshops. Today we are really excited to have Alison Beauvais Carris here to present to us, and we will turn the time over to her.
Awesome. Making sure I'm unmuted. Yay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much, Chicago Autism Network, for having me and for seeing the importance of this conversation. So, like Kimmy said, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. If you feel more comfortable using the chat, please do. I'll throw some out so that we can get conversation flowing. I'll be real, I do so much better as a therapist talking at people. So I'm going to look for your feedback in the chat. If you do not feel comfortable popping on camera, I completely understand also as the introvert in me. So let's go ahead and get going and dive into this idea of neuro-affirming care, what that entails. All right, so just to orient ourselves, a couple of things that we're going to talk on today are first and foremost, describing, defining, if you will, key terms, concepts, what it is we're talking about. Are we all talking about the same thing, right? Hopefully throughout this, you'll enhance your own self-awareness, both in how you see your loved one or folks that you might work with, and understanding. Also, my hope is to have you leave here today with some practical considerations and things that maybe you've thought of and validate what you're doing, or maybe you haven't thought of when you are supporting your loved one. So to get started, just want to share a little bit about who I am and the lens that I share this information through, because I think that's really important. So again, I'm Allison, whatever you're comfortable, she, her. I am a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, I'm a woman, I'm a colleague. I would love to see who's here. So drop your info in the chat. And what I'd love to know is, one, what's neuro-affirming care mean to you? And two, what are you hoping to get out of this? Because there's a lot of info packed in here, and I'd really rather, especially with an intimate group, talk to what's meaningful to you. So what do you want to get out of this? And what do you know about neuro-affirming care? Pop that in the chat for me. Quick disclaimer, the information here is within my scope of practice. I happen to be both a BCBA and an LCPC and a business owner. I've also been in the field for 20 years, and although I work primarily with adults now, I do a lot of work across the lifespan. So just keep that in mind. Again, it all comes through my particular lens. It might not be other providers. All right, so also the information that we present here is not meant to treat any one individual, generally speaking, or in particular, this is general information. So do keep that in mind as we're talking through. All right, so thank you. Continue. Put in, what is neuro-affirming care for you? I'm just reading these in the chat. Thank you. Awesome. So I want to share with you a definition that we really like at our organization, Behavioral Learning. We have a young adult learning center based in Oak Park, and then we also have a small group counseling practice where we serve folks actually across 3 different states, including throughout the entire state of Illinois. So the way that we look at things is neuro-affirming care is the idea that people have distinct neurology, and deviation from societal norms is not pathology, right? It's not bad, but instead brain differences are viewed as a valued and healthy part of society. Okay, so we're discussing this concept from a social disability model. That's really where this comes from. So really going in depth into that model is way beyond the time and scope that we have for this conversation today, but just know that that's where that comes from. And I want to acknowledge that not all disabled people subscribe to this model. So it is, however, more widely accepted view today, and we're moving towards it, if you will. It really stems from the neurodiversity movement. It grew out of the 80s and 90s, out of the disability rights movement. But again, the short story is it's a social model of disability that puts emphasis on the way that society treats people with disabilities. Okay, so this model argues that people with disabilities experience more difficulties from society and the challenges there than the actual disability itself. All right, so what that translates to for us as an organization is that we often say we don't treat autism, which sounds bizarre because 95% of the people that we serve identify as neurodivergent. But we don't treat autism. We treat the challenges that come with being autistic in a world that doesn't value those challenges, strengths, differences, fill in the blank, right? So again, it may seem like semantics or an oversimplification, but bear with me, we're going to continue to talk about. All right, so let's break down a little bit more terminology. If you're anything like me, words are meaningful. I'm a counselor, so like it's my job to listen, and what people say and how they say it is something that's important for me to pick up on. That doesn't mean that I always say the right thing at the right time. So I think it's important to know what we're talking about and who we're talking about and different ways that we can use some of this language. So just want to break some of it down together. Let's start with this word neurodiversity, right? This was actually not even seen in print until 1998, which to me feels like not that long ago, but it is a little while ago, right? I believe it was first found in print from a disability rights journalist, but really the term these days in the field is credited from Dr. Singer, Judy Singer specifically, her name's there at the bottom, who coined this term in her dissertation in the late 90s. And so what she wrote and says is that neurodiversity is a state of nature to be respected, right? It's an analytical view for examining social issues. And it's an argument for the conservation and facilitation of human diversity, right? So it's that, again, diversity is a natural part of life. All right. Another term, neurodivergent, right? So you've probably heard neurodiversity. You've definitely heard me throwing around the term neurodivergent. This is also different than the word neurodiversity, right? Neurodiversity is a concept or could be seen as a model, whereas neurodivergent, like the picture shows, is a brain that functions different from the group. That's it. So there's a group of people, one person's brain in that group functions different. We would say that individual is neurodivergent, right? Okay. Now, if we have a group of people and all the brains function differently, right? Or there's a few that function the same and a few that function different, we would say that that's a neurodiverse group, right? This group is neurodiverse, a group of all different brains. Okay, so they may work different, they may take in information different, they may process it different. All right, looking for feedback. We with me still? All right, I can see the screen. Oh, that was the old one. Great. All right, last but certainly not least, appreciate those thumbs up. I do want to just do a quick point about a couple of other words you'll hear me throw around today. And so again, neurodiversity by definition is diverse. Therefore, keep in mind that all people, autistics, for example, don't agree on which terms they like or dislike other people to use when describing them, right? So you may hear someone call themselves autistic. You may hear another person call themselves as someone on the spectrum or a person with autism. You may have heard the term ADHD, right? Or somebody with ADHD, or I have ADHD, disabled versus special needs. So you're going to hear me bouncing around with all of these because I'm talking to, again, a diverse group of people. I don't know how you choose to call yourself or your loved one. So when in doubt, ask the person, ask the caregiver what their preference is, and do your best to use the language that they prefer. All right. So let's jump into diagnoses. I don't want to focus here so much on like what exactly all the detailed diagnostic criteria is. Although if you do have questions on it, feel free to, to reach out and we can, discuss things more in depth about what that might mean for you or your loved one. Because really this could be its whole workshop on its own, right? But for the purposes of this evening, I do think it's important to share how specific diagnoses shape our understanding and support of our loved ones. So given that it sounds like from the group that most folks here care for somebody on the spectrum, autistic specifically, that's where I'm going to focus probably more heavily. But there's a few points I'm going to make for the diagnoses under the neurodivergent or neurodiverse umbrella. All right, so classical definition of neurodiversity, it's going to include diagnoses that we're going to get into in a minute, like autism, ADHD, intellectual disability, variety of communication and learning disorders. Okay. Um, Neuro-Affirming care, looking at diagnoses, means embracing differences beyond the diagnosis and accepting the whole person. Okay. So this doesn't mean, however, that we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's not to say that diagnoses aren't important. If from a neuro-affirming model, we have to embrace all differences. Diagnoses are very important for a couple of different reasons, and accurate diagnosis is important. Okay, so first and foremost, that old phrase "name it to tame it" is something that comes to mind, and often is something that many folks that we support, especially because we work a lot in our outpatient community with adults with late diagnosis autism or ADHD. That means they've been diagnosed 16 or above. And so what this means is sometimes people have been walking around feeling like they just don't fit, and now they have a word for it, and it really can provide some relief. So being able to label their experience can make them feel validated, heard in ways that maybe they haven't before, right? So name it to tame it. Additionally, a diagnosis is going to lead to access to funding and thus support, right? So in most states in the US, they have what's referred to commonly, like in Illinois, our autism bill, right? And this has opened up funding for different services and providers like behavior analysis and other behavior-based services specific to autism, and that private insurers must cover treatment. And there's also some legal components behind it. So it really can open up doors for funding and supports. Additionally, it adds legal protections, right? So you have the right diagnosis, you can also qualify for an IEP, right? There's different legal protections thanks to the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, right? So again, lots of support from the legal end as well. And I think just as important, we're going to get accurate treatment. So the way that, for example, an autistic individual experiences anxiety or depression, which we know that over half of folks on the spectrum, and I do think that numbers are probably higher, experience a co-occurring mental health disorder at some point in their lifetime. So an individual on the spectrum is going to experience anxiety, depression a little different than somebody who isn't on the spectrum. And so it's really important to know that, like, oh, you're autistic and you have anxiety, that treatment's going to look different. We'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of supports. All right, so let's start with autism spectrum disorder. All right, so I think most people on here, yes.
That's a quick question.
Yeah.
Yes, how does that vary from a neurotypical population? Half of people with autism will experience a mental health diagnosis. Yeah, how does that vary from others?
Yeah, like from general society.
Yes.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't have the statistics right in front of me. But it is actually, if I'm not mistaken, it's like they're broken down in the US. It's actually less than 10% have diagnosed anxiety, and there's depression is paired right along with that. Although since the pandemic, those numbers have been on the rise. So it's still fairly undiagnosed. Most mental health supports are, but I can get you those statistics later. You want me to email them to you?
It's helpful that the differentiation is, yeah, it sounds like it's very significant.
Yeah, so it's much higher than the general population is the short story. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Autism spectrum disorder, we're going to dive into this one a little bit more because, like I said, we're here in the Chicago Autism Network community. And I want to start just highlighting too that changes to the diagnostic criteria for many different diagnoses actually are fairly recent, and the latest manual actually came out, the text revision came out in just 2022. So we're talking, 2 years ago. So some of the diagnostic criteria are really only as old as that recent edition. Some of them were adapted and revised a little bit before that in the actual DSM-5, but just keep that in mind, that I think that is a good reminder for all of us that just as language is changing and evolving with society, although a little behind, diagnoses and criteria and understanding of mental health and behavioral health is changing too. All right, so Formally, a few years ago, more than 2 years ago, you may have seen separate diagnoses, especially if you have older children who are under now the autism umbrella. They may have been diagnosed as youngsters with PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, right? You may have seen Asperger's, different things like Brett's, all sorts of different things that are really now either moved to a different group or under the autism spectrum disorder umbrella, if you will. There's a variety of reasons for this. Lots of conversations and reading goes into it, but the short story is it's driven both by research and statistically. So with a broader diagnosis, we can capture folks who maybe didn't previously fit and they now can receive support. There's also some societal reasons, right, for shifting away from the individual diagnoses. There's some like history with the word Asperger and the name and who some of the work that that person did that maybe people don't like to be associated with who happen to formerly be diagnosed with Asperger's. So long story short, I love history. I can get into all of that. But how does that impact us today? Really, we're looking at two major components of criteria to fit under that autism umbrella. So from a general sense, the first one that I want to touch on is the idea of challenges in contextual and social communication. That's really one of the big one there, right? Challenges in contextual social interactions and communication. So one, and then that hypo or hyper reactivity to sensory input. Okay. So it's not simply, hey, this person has a difficulty reading and imitating nonverbal cues, but there's also a challenge with understanding. And then that's a challenge maintaining relationships. And I think it's really important to note here, it isn't a lack of desire to be social or to maintain or have meaningful connection. That desire for most, I would say almost all individuals that I've served and our organization serves over the years is there. It's that understanding and the challenge that comes with those social interactions and meaningful relationships. And then again, that second part there, hypo or hyper reactivity to sensory input. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in supports too. Right? Maybe this is even, you might see things that may seem like stereotypy, but it's not really stereotypy because it's really more self-soothing because somebody is hypersensitive, right? That means that they're really in tune to certain sensory experiences. And I think this is a great place to make a note about the individualized nature of the autistic experience. I'm sure everybody on here can find some similarities in their experience with other parents and caregivers, but you can also probably point out how your child is unique in their own perception of the world. So remember, an autistic individual might be, like I said, hypersensitive to something, really sensitive to, say, particular sounds or noises, and somebody else could be really hyposensitive, right? It doesn't faze them, or maybe they're super sensory seeking and they actually seek out those loud sounds in particular. I can think of many folks who I know who watch the same part of a video over and over and over again, right? Really to get like that same sound, that same auditory experience, where they're seeking it out. And I have somebody who, many folks who are super noise sensitive. So again, just some differences there. It's true for any of our five senses, right? Considering taste sensitivities, touch, think about the child who refuses to wear socks. I have one of those. They aren't being obstinate, right? Maybe they're hypersensitive and it is that darn seam, I tell you. And for somebody on the spectrum, these hypersensitivities, they can be painful. So I make light of it, but it can be an incredibly painful experience. And that can be hard for somebody who isn't neurodivergent to understand. It's not because I'm just want it my way. It's because it physically, viscerally hurts, right? So when we talk about accommodations, and we're going to, again, dive into this more when we get into supports, in this day and age, there's a lot of socks that are cost effective, in fact, that don't have seams. So like, that's what we chose to do in our house. So that was something where we chose not to die on that hill, because at the end of the day, I don't really value that my child wears a particular set of socks. I just want them to not get blisters because then I have to deal with that. So we're going to talk a little bit about values and making those hard choices, and when do we push as parents, especially, and as therapists. But just wanted to point out those two different components and how that experience can be so very unique. All right, so I want to highlight ADHD as well under this neurodivergent umbrella. So for ADHD, we're really understanding this a lot more and more. And I do think there's just an interesting highlight that we're noticing in society and many adults, identifying and publicly speaking out about both being autistic and an ADHDer. What we found and what the research is showing us as of late is that individuals with ADHD, they have differences in regions in their brain that's related to how emotions positively impact attention. Okay, so what I mean by that is an ADHD brain suppresses this emotional ability or kind of down regulates it. So the individual in essence is almost missing what we would call somatic markers. So the way we use emotions to make decisions. So if you think about it, for a neurotypical brain, our attention is drawn to things with what we'd say are emotionally meaningful, like they have emotional weight to them, right? However, with an ADHD brain, everything has equal emotional weight. So it's not that they aren't trying to pay attention to maybe what you're saying, but their shirt has a tag on it, and it is the same emotional weight as the words coming out of your mouth. And it is the same emotional weight as the cicadas that are losing their mind outside. And it is the same emotional weight as this loud thought that they're having in their head about how Pokemon, it needs to get played again. So all of these things are coming at them at once, and they're equally important. It's often hard, as you can imagine, to differentiate if it's all at that same wavelength or frequency. It's not to say that every HDer has the same level of challenges with differentiation. It might be related to one person is more sensitive to sound, one person is more sensitive to touch or taste. It may be that there's varying levels in terms of context to how much or how little. So, but again, it's not that somebody doesn't want to attend. Often you see folks with ADHD get really frustrated because they want to. It's just that it's so hard to sort through it all because it's just all meaningful, right? So I think this is an important piece that we're talking more and more about, is that emotions can help us sort out what's important. So it can impact our ability to remember too. And so sometimes you may hear, oh, they have ADHD, they're so forgetful, or they're lying, or something along those lines. It's that our memories are linked to those highly emotional experiences, right? So if we don't have that emotional weight to it, then that memory isn't going to be solidified in the same way. Right, just checking my time. All right. Also under this umbrella is intellectual disability. Now, I didn't say earlier, any of these can also be co-occurring. We have folks on the spectrum who also have an intellectual disability. We have folks on the spectrum who also have ADHD, right? So that just adds to the layers that can be challenging for loving and parenting that person, and also for them understanding who they are and what they need. So in this sense, I'm putting them in, little compartments, but just want to recognize that life isn't always that neat and tidy. All right, so intellectual disability, I think, is a big change in a more recent criteria, and I think is a really important one to note, is that it is characterized or diagnosed by both cognitive disabilities, right? So IQ, and challenges in adaptive functioning. Okay, so again, really important. It is not just IQ alone anymore. That's what used to be the only factor, really, in someone acquiring a disability, intellectual disability, specifically diagnosis. All right. I will tell you there's some, speaking of language and things that have shifted and changed, it was only in 2010 that Senate signed a law to replace mental retardation with intellectual disability. And so it's nice to see that we've got this official change in the diagnostic manual. So one of the reasons that came as well to reflect the changes in society. All right. So again, adaptive functioning and cognitive disability. The piece that I was saying is that this could be an entire conversation on its own to break down all the learning, communication, and sensory disorders that don't already fit under ASD, ADHD, and intellectual disabilities. So just know that if you don't carry one of those first three, it's okay. There could be another label that is going to help to identify your or your loved one's experience. And so continue to seek information out. And that really is, I think, the biggest shift in the diagnostic criteria that I really appreciate is it's really looking to be more inclusive so that everybody can get the support that they need. All right. So speaking of support, I do want to dive in for, yes, so we've got a good, hopefully maybe 15 minutes. And then we can take any questions too that you think of at the end and talk through. So we've got a layer of understanding what do we mean when we say neurodivergent, what all falls under that umbrella in terms of diagnoses and how those diagnoses and the importance of those labels can be helpful. Let's talk about what kind of supports that can be meaningful when we are caring for, both loving and working with somebody who is on the spectrum, for example. All right, I want to start first by just identifying and defining this term value, because this is from which the work that we do at behavioral learning and really identifies and defines that neuro-affirming approach. This is the lens that we are using. It's the idea that everyone, every individual, also every family, and oftentimes many individual cultures have their own value, not just in and of themselves, but values, right? What do you value? What do you care about in essence, deep down in your heart? All right. What is most meaningful to you? And so I want to take a second and clarify this, because as a parent, this is what you're going to pass down to your child, right? You're going to teach them what's meaningful to this family. And so we used, again, the words to describe what we care about as we're diving into support. And because these are our chosen life directions. So I like to think about using that same metaphor of values as a compass, right? So like a value, which is a little different than a goal, right? A goal is much more concrete. There's often a start and an end point to it. You either did it or you didn't. A value doesn't have a starting and ending point, right? It isn't something we put on our to-do list and check it off, right? We can always be moving in that value direction, excuse me. On a personal note, I value parenting. And as a mom of two tiny humans, if I truly value parenting, right, this isn't something I get to put on my checklist as much as I would like to some days, and that I just accomplish it when they're both 18 and they move out of the house, I can just be like, yeah, now I'm done parenting, right? This is a forever job. Even when our kids are no longer on this earth, we are still engaging in parenting and value that parenting and engaging in actions that align with that value of parenting. So it's the same idea when supporting a neurodivergent individual, right? If we go back, like I said earlier, to that socks example, I'm not going to make them wear socks that are painful to them, especially when there's an accommodation, because we're using a neuro-affirming model, right? That accommodations are a part of that. Because our world is really not very accommodating to differences, right? So I can't imagine a child or a family who values socks with seam, right? So this is just arbitrary, just going with the same example. So much they value this that they wish to inflict that pain on their child, right? No, it's like figure something else out so that you can at least leave the house and not get blistered. There's other alternatives, right? On the flip side, what about the family who values quality time, much like our own family, and the child's unable to tolerate a long car ride, right? Does it mean that the family never takes vacation any longer than an hour away? No, that's not what we're saying here, because this behavior is linked to a value, something that is really, really meaningful to that family or that individual, right? Friendship is a huge one in our community because we work a lot with adolescents, right? So if it's meaningful for you to have a friend, for you to be a friend, then it might mean that you have to apologize for something you said because your filter wasn't on, right? So that could be really uncomfortable. So we're going to practice it. We're going to role play it. We're going to work on how can we do these kinds of things, because this is valued. Okay. All right. So I have a very quick list that we're going to break down. And I'm happy to also just talk about these things too, if we want to have this be more of a conversation. But I think that it is so important, first and foremost, to ask our community that is as soon as you are able, right? So I know there are a couple of parents of littles on this call tonight. It may not be appropriate to ask them. They also may not have the words or the tools yet to be able to communicate what it is that's meaningful or accommodations they might want. That is something they can learn, right? That self-advocacy is so important. So what we did, because we do have the luxury of that, and the work that we do is we asked our community at Behavioral Learning and said, what is it? What are the supports and the accommodations that you most appreciate, that you wish you knew or had access to when you were younger, that you really appreciated that your parents did or wish your parents had done? Okay. And so in that, this is the list they came up with. All right. So I want to break these down a little bit into some specific meaningful strategies. So first and foremost, patience. This one really isn't a strategy. It's more of a like, hey, give yourself some grace. Give your child some grace. I think I also put in with this one humor was what one particular individual was like. I really appreciated that, my dad woke me up with a squirt gun one day. It sucked at the time. I'm not suggesting that you do that as a specific intervention. He had a very unique experience, and his dad has a very unique sense of humor. But it's that idea of validate, be kind to yourself, be kind to your child, and that when you're upset, apologize. Model to them what you would want them to do, because it's okay to be upset because you're human. And this is something and someone you care deeply about. So of course you're going to get upset if they're, hurting, right? If they're not listening, if they're doing something that's upsetting, you care about them. Structure was a big one. So these are actually in order of like how common these terms or concepts came up in our conversations and our questionnaires. So structure was huge. One particular person said, routine is my comfort, right? I thought those were pretty strong words, right? We can't always build structure. Life is not always spelled out for us, but knowing what is coming next, right? First, then language is so important, is so meaningful. Being able to teach someone how to make a list is a wonderful skill. Even at a very young age, right? We can do this with pictures. We can do this with some of the, most clever tools and Velcro systems out there, right? Structure, that's what that provides, is structure. Clarifies expectations, goes in there too, right? So we go into a new situation, or we go into an old situation, and it's the reminder of the rules. Okay, we're going to be going into the movie theater. Here's what you can expect. It's a pretty sensory orienting or disorienting experience, right? We just did this today, actually, at our center, and we go out in the community and various places, outside of the four walls that we have. And it's going over like, okay, so cell phones are in pockets when we are out walking or when we are, waiting for the bus, because people have lost them periodically, not paying attention, right, as they're crossing the street. So setting those expectations up, providing that structure is really meaningful and sought out specifically by our autistic community. All right, socialization. So this is a big one too. Again, I think this is so important and so neat. This came up third, seriously, as like what's meaningful to our adolescents and young adults is that idea of access to meaningful social relationships, right? So again, although somebody on the spectrum may struggle with making these connections, we know that that's part of the diagnostic criteria. It doesn't mean they don't want them. So keep in mind that play, if you will, for an autistic child is going to look different at times than a neurotypical child. Parallel play is very common. It's a developmental milestone for children. It does extend often. It looks a lot like parallel play in adolescents and young adults on the spectrum. What I mean by that is you may have two folks in the same room, maybe even sitting on the same couch, and they are each maybe even on their phone. They could both be playing Minecraft, and they are not talking to each other. They are not making eye contact. They're not touching each other. And you're like, oh my gosh, what is happening? Are they even friends? And you ask them both individually. Yeah, they both had a great time, right? They got to do something that they enjoy in the presence of somebody else who didn't have many expectations. And so that is okay. That is meaningful. It is human connection in a way that just may look different. We call it hanging out alone. Actually, one of our learners coined that. So I thought that was a really good description, right? Just gonna hang out by myself with a friend. Transition and change is the next one here on the list, right? These are hard for anybody, frankly. These are hard with a capital HARD for our folks on the spectrum, right? So if you know in advance of a schedule change, right, think about how helpful that is when you can share that with your child, right? Oh, we were going to go here today and, go to grandma's, and now we're going to go run and to get gas really quick. Like even those little changes in the car, if it isn't the same route, our folks on the spectrum like to put things in boxes. They like to categorize things. That goes with thoughts in their heads too, and the expectations that they're having. So if they had in their head that they were going to take this route home and now they're not going right home, take a minute, explain it. Okay, here's where we're going, rather than start on that change and then have them realize they're not going on the same route. Proactive, reactive. Maybe it's easier to deal with it reactively. Maybe it's easier to, manage things proactively. You know your kid the best. But keep in mind that any kind of transitions and change are just going to be hard. So when you can create some expectations or clarify when those changes are happening or how they're going to look in advance, that is often preferred, right? Choice is something that can also be a very powerful intervention. There are some things that are just not a choice. I think of things like safety and health, right? There are other things where even the smallest, there are many small, tiny ways that we can find to offer choice in a decision, even as with a small child, from are they going to wear the purple pants or the blue pants, right? Which ones? So being able to offer that in any way is always, I shouldn't say always going to be an option, is often an option, actually, is the word I wanted to use, because I will say that too much choice can be overwhelming. So this is, it's a funny way to say offer choice unless it's too much. How do you know it's too much? Well, again, you know your kid. So, if more than two choices they're going to freeze and they're just not going to pick anything, which is a choice, then two choices it is, right? Maybe somebody needs a lot more options and they need to talk through what those options are. Maybe it just depends on the context, right? So keep in mind that choice is a powerful tool. And so you want to use it in a way that's going to be meaningful for you and for your loved one, right? So environment is another one here. And so what we mean by that, right, is the space around us, the world around us, even sometimes the people around us, right? If you remember how I was saying with ADHD, it said that they struggle determining, what things to pay attention to because of reading that emotional importance, if you will, having those somatic markers that clarify that. This is where environmental modifications are key, right? So if it's hard to attend to something because it's unclear what is important and you should be attending to, quote unquote, then let's add some environmental information that you can take in to determine where you should be attending, right? This is such a great way to help someone attend to things are labels, right? Label pictures, words, where do the toys go, right? What is in what drawer in the bedroom or at school, color-coded folders, pockets in the backpack, all of the things, label it, label it, label it. Doesn't mean they have to be there forever, but for now, label it. We often say, put it in its home, right? So at our center, everything has a home. Myself included, I'm like, why are the scissors not home? Like, where did they go? So like we do that and espouse that model in the work that we do, because it, again, similar to that structure and that routine, it brings comfort. Somebody knows where to find something. It just, it's simple as that. It's less stress, right? You can also think about this in the school setting. And so this is something that I used to do a lot of work, and I worked for many years in a therapeutic day school, and being able to teach and use different color coding systems like carpet and painted walls where the teacher would stand. So it would clue in for that person to attend to that area. So we're going to look in the green area right now, right? And here's what's happening in the green area, right? And the paper behind that teacher is green. There is a green dot, right? So there's lots of different ways that you can subtly, or not so subtly, adjust the environment to help somebody tune in to what is meaningful. It's also helpful to minimize things that are distracting, right? So that's where noise canceling headphones can be helpful for some folks who are distracted by different sounds or auditory sensations, right? That's where different clothing, come back to the socks or the tags on the shirts or what have you, can be really helpful. So thinking about ways to minimize distractions in the environment is also going to help set somebody up for success. And then last but certainly not least is ask, right? So like I said earlier regarding labels, what language does someone prefer? It goes beyond their own labels and bringing them again into that conversation as soon as they're able. What kind of supports do they need? They may not know yet, and that's okay. As soon as you know, as mom or dad, then being able to teach them how to act, right? Have that voice, engage in self-advocacy, ask for any of these things up here. Hey, I need you to have patience with me. Like I'm working on this. It's not that I don't care. I'm just having a hard time figuring it out, right? Like ask for accommodations. Who do you ask? Teaching all of those kinds of pieces that are a part of this world that we live in can be challenging. So creating a space where somebody can do that is going to be really meaningful. Right. I am finally looking in the chat. Sorry, I got distracted there and missed a couple of these. Awesome. Oh, such a great point, Martha. Yes, the differentiation and the diversity within the diagnosis of autism is very broad. So having type 1 and type 2, I'm sure you see those differences. Yes, and it's such a great point with, just reading the chat here, I am also parenting an extrovert, and I am definitely an introvert, so that's a whole new thing as well. And then you add neurodiversity or neurodivergence on top of it, and yeah, it's challenging. I feel you, Martha. Excellent. Thanks, Danielle. Yes, yes. Thank you, Lupe. All right. So all of this to say, I went ahead and put together a little handout here for you that just summarizes basically all the information that we just talked about. We've got some language that's important over here on the right. We've got a little blurb about neuro-affirming care as it relates to diagnoses. And so this is here at your disposal. It's also here for, the general consumption. You can check it out on our website, which I put up here, and I'm going to also drop it in the chat so you can download it if it's interesting or helpful to you. All right. It's on our resource page. But the piece I didn't specifically put in is some of those supports. So what I would encourage you to do is reach out to your provider. Bring that list in and say like, hey, are we already doing some of these? Or take a look at it yourself and be like, oh, I am. Like, okay. I hope that the list and the conversation today was also validating that you know what you're doing. It is the world that is just not always supportive. And that's the model that we take at behavioral learning. That is neuro-affirming care, being able to lift somebody up, to value their differences and recognize their struggles and make those accommodations because they have things they care about too. All right. So that brings us to the end of our time. We have 5 minutes. I hope.